All right, so let's dive into this whole thing with Trump's trade tariffs. We're focusing on the ones he put on Canada, Mexico, and China back on March 3rd. Got a bunch of news articles and some analysis to dig through, so let's jump in.
Yeah, right off the bat, this move kind of shook things up globally. Like the U.S. stock market took a hit, economists were scratching their heads, even America's closest allies were caught off guard.
Yeah, it does seem a bit strange to mess with such important trading relationships, doesn't it? And especially when you think about how Trump always says those import duties are paid by foreign countries, not us.
Right, and that's where economists are like, hold on a second. That idea that foreign producers just eat the cost of tariffs, it doesn't really fly in the real world. Economics 101 tells us those costs usually trickle down, ending up hitting consumers with higher prices.
So it's not just as easy as saying, hey, you guys pay for this.
Nope, not at all. And that's why a lot of economists were quick to call that out. There's a real worry that these tariffs could actually backfire and end up hurting the very people they're supposed to help.
Okay, so if the economics of it are shaky, what was Trump really going for with these tariffs?
Well, the sources you gave me point to a few different things. Some of the reasons they give, like worries about immigration or fentanyl, seem a little weak, especially when you look at the bigger political picture.
You're talking about the tension with Canada and Mexico?
Exactly. Remember, this was when Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau was standing his ground against U.S. pressure on Ukraine, and Mexican President Sheinbaum was kind of making fun of Trump's moves. Those political clashes probably had something to do with these tariffs.
So maybe this was more about playing politics than making smart economic choices.
Seems that way. In fact, Trump's advisor, Jason Miller, even hinted that this whole trade war thing would be a big talking point in Trump's speech to Congress. He called it a defense strategy, which makes it sound even more political.
Interesting. It sounds like he was really digging in on this approach, even though things were uncertain on the economic front. Now, you said earlier that economists weren't buying this idea of foreign countries footing the bill for tariffs. Can you unpack that a little more? Why are they so skeptical about that?
Well, let's break it down. If a foreign company suddenly has to pay more to ship their stuff to the U.S. because of tariffs, they've got a couple of choices. They can either take the hit to their profits or try to pass those costs on to American buyers by raising prices. And in a competitive market, they're going to go for the price hike more often than not.
That makes sense. So in the end, it's the American shopper who's paying more for those imported goods.
You got it. The tariffs basically create a kind of artificial inflation, making everything from cars to washing machines pricier for American buyers.
And that brings us to an interesting twist in this whole story. Amidst all this skepticism from economists, you have the United Auto Workers, a union that usually leans Democrat, actually backing these tariffs.
It is kind of surprising, right?
Yeah.
But when you look at it from their point of view, it makes a little more sense. They see these tariffs as a way to protect American manufacturing jobs. Their argument is that decades of this so-called free trade have led to fewer American manufacturing jobs, and they see these tariffs as a way to fight back against that trend.
So they're basically saying, we got to look out for our workers, even if it means things cost a bit more for consumers.
Pretty much, yeah. They're saying the benefits of keeping American jobs outweigh the costs of slightly higher prices. They also point the finger at corporations if those companies decide to jack up prices a lot, rather than just taking a slightly smaller profit.
Sounds like they're walking a tightrope, trying to keep their members happy while also recognizing that consumers might feel the pinch.
They are. And they're actively working with the Trump administration to figure out how these tariffs are put into practice, probably trying to make sure American workers aren't negatively impacted.
That's a really fascinating dynamic. So you've got this unexpected team up between a Republican president and a union that usually sides with Democrats, both pushing for these tariffs, even with warnings from economists. Now, I know there are some voices speaking out against this too, especially from folks directly affected by these tariffs.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The Detroit Automakers Trade Association is waving red flags, saying these tariffs are going to end up hurting American car companies in the long run. They're asking the administration to think it over or at least give them a pass.
So they're basically saying that these tariffs will mess up their supply chains, make production more expensive, and ultimately make American-made cars less competitive globally.
That's exactly it. They're arguing that these tariffs are a Band-Aid solution that'll cause more problems for the American auto industry than they'll solve.
Okay, so it's like a tug-of-war here. On one side, you've got Trump, the UAW, and probably some everyday Americans who think these tariffs are necessary to protect American jobs and industries. On the other side, you've got economists, trade experts, and some businesses saying these tariffs are going to cause more harm than good. leading to higher prices, economic instability, and maybe even retaliation from other countries.
You nailed it. It's a complicated issue with no easy answers, and the potential fallout is huge.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're getting into the nitty-gritty of a real-world problem, looking at the motivations, the arguments, and the potential consequences.
And it's important to keep in mind that these decisions have real-world impacts on people's lives, their jobs, how they make a living.
Absolutely. So for those listening, as we continue this deep dive, I want you to think about this. If you were calling the shots, how would you handle this? Would you go with the folks who want to protect American industries with tariffs? Or would you prioritize free trade and working together with other countries?
That's a tough one, isn't it? And that's why it's so important to understand all sides of this before making up your mind. Now, the auto industry is obviously a big part of this whole trade war thing, but other sectors are feeling the heat too, like steel and aluminum. Those were some of the first industries Trump went after with tariffs early on in his presidency.
Oh, yeah. I remember that causing a lot of drama, especially with Europe.
Exactly. And those tariffs kind of rippled through the economy, affecting everything from construction to manufacturing. And then there's agriculture, which has been hit hard by China's retaliation. Soybean farmers especially got squeezed because China, a huge buyer of U.S. soybeans, started looking for other places to get their soybeans.
So it's not just about cars and trucks. This is a trade war that's hitting all sorts of industries and workers. This really gets to the heart of a much bigger argument about globalization and its impact, doesn't it? I mean, you have this group, the UAW, usually aligned with labor, siding with a Republican president on this. Shows you how complicated it is.
You got it. This isn't a simple left versus right issue. It's like a clash of different ideas about economics and fears about globalization. On the one hand, you've got the argument for free trade, which is all about open markets and integrating the global economy. The idea is that by making trade easier, everyone wins. You get more competition, lower prices, and a bigger variety of goods and services.
And on the other side, you have the protectionist view, which says some industries need to be protected from foreign competition to keep jobs here and prevent those key sectors from disappearing.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of a zero-sum lens comes in, something we talked about before. Trump often looks at trade deals like this, meaning he thinks if one country benefits, the other one has to lose. So the goal becomes to win trade deals by selling as much as possible and buying as little as possible, even if it means using tactics like tariffs.
That's a helpful way to think about it. It explains why he might see tariffs as a way to show dominance or pressure other countries into giving him what he wants, even if it risks messing up the economy.
It's a big gamble. Think of it like a game of economic chess. Every move could trigger a bunch of countermoves, leading to things you didn't expect.
And that's exactly what's happening, right? We talked about China hitting back with tariffs on agricultural products, but other countries are doing the same to U.S. goods in response to Trump's moves.
That's right. And those retaliatory measures just escalate the trade war, creating this ripple effect that can destabilize the whole global economy. It's a vicious cycle of tariffs going up and up, which ultimately hurts everyone involved.
So where do we go from here? Is there any way out of this trade war, or are we just stuck on this crazy ride of tariffs and counter-tariffs?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's hard to say what's going to happen. It depends on a lot of things, like whether everyone is willing to negotiate, what the political climate is like in each country, and how the global economy is doing overall.
So we're all just waiting and watching, hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst.
Kinda, yeah. But it's not completely out of our hands. Public awareness and getting involved can actually influence trade policy. People who understand what's going on can contact their representatives, support groups that advocate for fair trade, and stay engaged in the conversation about these issues.
That's a good point. We shouldn't just sit back and watch. We can actually have a say in shaping global trade by speaking up. But before we get into that, let's go back to the arguments for and against these tariffs, looking at both the short-term and long-term effects.
Yeah, let's break it down.
All right, so let's get into those arguments for and against tariffs. Let's start with the potential upsides.
Well, one of the main arguments for tariffs, like we've been talking about, is that they can help protect industries here at home from foreign competition. The thinking is that by making those imported goods more expensive, tariffs give domestic producers an advantage, allowing them to ramp up production, hire more workers, and contribute more to the economy.
So it's basically a way to shield those industries that are seen as really important for national security or the overall economy.
Exactly. And this is especially attractive in areas like manufacturing, where job losses because of globalization have been a big worry for a long time.
Makes sense. And you mentioned earlier that the UAW, for example, sees these tariffs as a way to protect American manufacturing jobs and undo what they call the free trade disaster.
Right. And it's not just about saving existing jobs either. People who support tariffs say they can also breathe new life into struggling industries and even encourage new ones to pop up.
So the idea is that tariffs can kind of kickstart domestic industries and help them become more competitive globally.
That's the idea. But of course, it's not all good news. There are some serious downsides to tariffs that we got to talk about.
Let's get into that. What are some of the main arguments against tariffs?
Well, one of the most obvious downsides is that tariffs make things more expensive for people. Like we discussed earlier, when tariffs come into play, those costs often get passed along. And eventually it's the consumer who ends up paying more for those imported goods.
So even though tariffs are supposed to protect American businesses, they can also end up hurting consumers by making everyday things more expensive.
Yeah, exactly. And for folks who are already struggling to make ends meet, those price increases can really make a difference in their lives.
That's a really important point. And it's not just about the impact on consumers, right? There are bigger economic consequences, too.
Absolutely. Another big worry is that tariffs can disrupt global trade and create instability in the economy. When countries start slapping tariffs on each other's goods, it sets off a chain reaction that can slow down economic growth, discourage investment, and ultimately hurt everyone involved.
You mentioned earlier that it can turn into this back and forth of tariffs as countries retaliate against each other's protectionist moves.
Right. And that kind of escalation can lead to a full-blown trade war, which is basically a no-win situation.
So it sounds like tariffs are a bit of a gamble. They might offer some short-term benefits to certain industries, but they also come with the risk of causing long-term economic damage both here in the U.S. and around the world.
That's a good way to put it. And that's why this whole issue is so complicated and controversial. There are strong arguments on both sides. And in the end, it comes down to weighing the potential benefits against the potential risks.
And that's where you, the listener, come in. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to think about everything we've talked about. Think about the reasons behind these tariffs, the arguments for and against them, and the potential long-term consequences. Where do you stand on this? Do you think these tariffs were a necessary move to protect American jobs and industries? Or do you think they were a mistake that will ultimately cause more harm than good? It's a tough question, but by really digging into these complex issues, by looking at the evidence and considering different points of view, you can form your own educated opinion. Thanks for joining us on this Don't Dive, and until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.